Good evening, everyone. I would like to call the Committee of the Whole Budget meeting to order and welcome everyone to the meeting. I would like to acknowledge that our meeting takes place on unceded Algonquin territory, and I would like to thank the Algonquin Nation for hosting us on their land. I was wondering, did everyone had a copy of the agenda? Yes? Can I have a mover for the agenda? Trustee Seward? Is there any changes to the agenda? Seeing none, I'd like to take a vote. All those in favor of the agenda? Our meeting takes place on unceded Algonquin territory, and I would like to thank the I'd like to call in the director to introduce report 17-046. Everyone had a copy of.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And as all of you are aware, Budget Committee has been meeting for several months, and we are now in our final phase, which is the presentation of the staff recommended budget. Without further ado, I will pass it over to the CFO and his team to make that presentation.
I'd like to take a vote. All those in favor?
Thanks, Mr. Chair, and we will we'll do this in two pieces tonight. I have some opening remarks, and then we'll just help guide people to some spots in the binder, and then we will, following that, work our way through a presentation similar to the one you've seen at previous budget meetings, just so you can see the continuity of where we started in November and how we've got to where we are. So I'll try to be brief, but still make sure that we can provide enough information for your consideration of this budget. And we will, tonight we are presenting the staff recommended budget for 2017-2018, and it is one more step on the process we began in the fall. It's also an important step in our efforts to provide the best possible learning opportunities for every one of our students while working towards the goals that are identified in the multi-year financial recovery plan and the board's own strategic plan. The budget we've developed really includes a couple of major components. We have identified in the budget those staff reductions which had been approved during academic staffing, the reductions which were made as a result of the decisions following the accommodation review process, and additional reductions which would have been required in the number of education workers as we work to balance the budget. I am pleased to say, though, that these are offset. In fact, they're more than offset by the addition of approximately 87 full-time equivalents as a result of the additional local priorities funding that was provided in the grants for student needs. In total, the budget includes provision for approximately 136 more full-time equivalents than the 2016-17 budget. In addition to those that were funded through the LPF, it reflects the higher enrollment we experienced in 2016-2017. You'll recall that we did add staff in the fall of 2016 in order to respond to that higher enrollment, as well as we've been able to accommodate some internal changes inside the budget itself, which were correcting previous allocation errors. The OCDSB also benefited from some significant grant changes. Additional money was provided to school boards, and this was the first year of a two-year phase-in, aimed at reducing the junior and intermediate average class size, putting a cap on kindergarten classes sizes, and the move to standardized salaries of teachers in adult education programs. Those have provided additional dollars which have allowed us to partially reinstate some of the funds for professional development and professional learning that had been reduced in prior years. It allows us to provide $700,000 in 17-18, which we hope will be annualized for following years at the level of $1.4 million annually to provide support for the acquisition and use of mobile devices by students. It's allowed us to provide an additional $330,000 in funding to support projects in learning support services, including the continued implementation of the improved IEP process and software, and ongoing and additional training in behavior management systems. Appendix E and F of the binder, page 36 and 37, include more details. I'd also point out that if you look at the appendix, it shows a reduction in school budgets of 5%. I need to point out, though, in discussion with principals, there was agreement that this reduction could be managed by most schools, considering the change we've made with respect to the cost of occasional teachers next year. Those costs and the variances will be centralized. That is, schools will no longer be required to cover those over expenditures out of their own operating budget. Considering that we've removed that pressure from those budgets, we heard that most schools should be able to manage. As always, if there are schools in unique circumstances, either because of size or ongoing operating challenges, we will work with them to make sure that the school can effectively operate. Staff believe the OCDSB has made significant progress in its return to balanced budgets. Mr. Gardner and I speak fairly regularly with ministry staff, and they, as recently as Monday, expressed their willingness to review with us in the fall after the completion of the 2016-2017 financial statements, whether the OCDSB, in fact, could look for or might require an additional year to reach the surplus targets that were identified by the government last year, if they're required. It is also quite clear, though, that they expect to see us continue to make progress, and they expect us to approve a balanced budget. That's why staff have worked diligently to try to ensure that where we needed to make investments in the district to continue to support student learning, we looked for internal cost reductions or cost containment wherever possible. We will have a brief review of the binder. I do apologize for the late production of the binder. As we've said, though, the late announcement of the GSNs significantly complicated our process, our budget process this year. We had staff trying to make some of the final edits as late as Saturday this week, and fortunately they didn't reveal any errors. But I think it is important to acknowledge that members of the committee will require some time to digest the binder itself. With your indulgence, Mr. Chair, I'll just take a minute. At the beginning of the binder, as always, you'll see the basic letter of transmittal and the report that was posted last week to the website. Begins at the first tab at page 3 of the budget binder. Again, it highlights and shows some of the detail that we've been discussing in terms of our surplus and the changes we've made. The next piece that is an important part of this document is the budget overview. Beginning on folio on page 26, we identify the changes in our grants year over year. Obviously the significant increase in 2017-18 from the budget recognizes that we are carrying an enrollment of 600 or 700 higher on the elementary enrollment. That is built into the 17-18 budget, as well as all of the investment funds and the additional funding required to fund the cost of the collective agreements that were extended for the next 2 years. I think, Mr. Chair, it's always interesting for us to note to see the growth in this budget. We're now approaching that $1 billion target. I know we wrestle with it. We as staff talked about what is the point of showing a surplus of $4,000 on estimated revenues and expenditures of $928 million. We're not that good. Having said that, we felt it was important, though, to show that it is balanced, and we have wrestled to make sure it was balanced this year. The next page, page 27, is where we look at the net enveloping, comparing our funding and our expenditures to the ministry's main funding envelopes. I will just point out that we continue to see ourselves overspend in 2 areas. Special education is overspent by somewhere around 5.5%, which I think we've managed to hold that percentage of overspending to this level over the last couple of years. I think that is something that the board should be pleased with, because we've been able to maintain and in some cases improve our services to kids. And it has been, we acknowledge the work of everyone involved, from our trustees, members of SEAC, members of staff that have worked to produce that. In transportation, in spite of the additional funding we received a couple of years ago, we are in a slight deficit with transportation. It's being driven by a number of factors. The ongoing challenge in the province with respect to the cost of school purpose vehicles, and the continued increase in the cost of transportation as it relates to small vehicles. We've discussed this in a number of different forums. Due to behaviors and due to program issues, we continue to see increased costs with respect to small vehicles. The other area that we are slightly overspent in with respect to the overall budget is facilities. We are overspent by a little less than 1%. Some of those dollars we will see reductions in future years as we continue with our student learning and accommodation review process. Because of the reductions we've made in the past, we did not feel this was a year to make significant reductions. In fact, we as senior staff turned down some requests for initiatives, and we've asked the department to go back and look for internal solutions. So I think it shows that we are moving in the right direction. In total, the overall instruction balance, instruction and special education are approximately equal. I think the other items that I draw your attention to in this area, beginning on folio 32 and 33 and thereon, gives you the detail of the items that are in the letter of transmittal itself. Appendix B talks about some of those changes that we've seen on expenses and on revenues beyond where we were expecting them. This one is especially grants. A couple of significant ones. The grant for urban priorities has in fact increased by a little more than $60,000. The grant that we receive for temporary accommodations, that's to assist us with the cost of portable moves and relocations, was reduced. Part of that is in recognition of the new schools we opened this year and the new Vimy Ridge School that will open in September. On Appendix C, we've reproduced the chart that we showed in earlier as part of the accommodation review, showing those changes that impacted upon the budget, and of course they had ongoing revenue impacts as well. Appendix D, we've tried to capture those decisions that were already made with respect to academic staffing. And Appendix E and F are really the changes that we're making at this stage and that we're recommending. As we've indicated, before we were aware of the extent of the changes that might be coming through the Local Priorities Fund, we had identified the need to make some internal changes. We identified the need to reduce approximately 13 positions in school administration positions and education workers. We had identified the ability to reduce 2 positions in LSS in central, one in its central admin position due to an upcoming retirement, and one a decrease in a social work position which was vacant. In facilities, we identified that we had 10 vacant positions, 2 in maintenance, 8 in custodial. Then we had looked at the central departments. We've identified there was the potential for 2 half positions to be reduced centrally. At least one of them is a union exempt position, if not both of them. Then we looked at how we could support those projects that we've been talking to you about over the last 6 months in terms of improving what I call our human infrastructure to better support schools. So again, on folio 36, you have the details, very brief details. We needed to be able to provide 2 additional positions to business and learning technologies in order to support and to drive our work on a client portal for parents. We identified that in payroll, I think you've heard us talk about this in human resources and in payroll over the last 2 or 3 years, the ongoing changes as a result of collective agreements, as a result of the changes in benefits management, have put incredible stress on our staff. It's also put stress on our existing payroll and HRIS information systems. These additional positions are required for us to be able to ensure that these key business functions can occur. We identified 2 positions, Coordinator of Workplace Safety and Insurance Board, and a Coordinator of Disability Management. Those 2 positions, we are recommending that they will be created. Those should be self-funding within a year or so. We believe that improved monitoring of people away on longer-term disability, people that are involved in worker safety claims and their absences, if those can be managed and the return to work facilitated, we believe, and there are statistics provincially that show these positions should pay for themselves. Obviously, that's not all going to happen in the first year. We've also identified the need for an additional project manager position to help us as we work our way through the ongoing challenges as we move to implement the changed student systems that are coming to the province as a result of consolidation in the industry. And finally, we do have a requirement for a term position. We put it in the budget because we know that we need that support of an absence administrator while we're doing this kind of work. On Folio 37, again, we've summarized very quickly some of the additional investments that are required. We've tried to, in the budget, create additional dollars that will support professional development for principals and vice principals. We've provided the seed money to begin the support for the development of the second IB site in the west. We know that we need to be proceeding with applications, development, and the commitment in the 16-17 year is estimated to be approximately $100,000. We are recommending the reinvestment of $135,000. Over the last few years, we've held those budgets constant. They weren't reduced, but they weren't increased either. And as our service provider increased their daily rate to us, we saw a decline in service. This increase in funding should allow us to return to the previous level of service, and we believe it's an important part of our approach to supporting our students in need. We've already talked a little bit about the reduction in school operating budgets, that we believe that's more than offset by the relief they will feel from the central assumption of the OT overages. In LSS, we were able to provide approximately $250,000 to support 2 very important initiatives. First, ongoing and continued BMS training, which is a commitment that we as a district have made in order to particularly to try to support staff in their extremely challenging daily jobs. The work with the continued implementation of new software in learning support services, particularly with this year with respect to ensuring a more consistent and a more effective IEP and a more timely IEP, requires an increase in licensing fees. We've been able to support that. Last year, we made reductions to professional development. Those reductions in professional development, professional learning across the system were harsher and had an adverse impact. We have recommended that it be re-implemented. Approximately $330,000 will be direct support to schools for that sort of work. We also have a further $400,000 with professional development and trying to reinstate some of the operating budgets that curriculum services had reduced over the years. We are able, as I said earlier, to recommend an investment in mobile devices for students of $700,000 for 2017-18. We believe that that amount needs to be $1.4 million annually, and we believe that we will be able to increase that amount in the, if I get the year right, 18-19 year, as we see the continued phase-in of money from class sizes and the adult education. There's a 2-year phase-in of that grant. In addition, we've tried to clean up some budgets. We know that our schools on an ongoing basis face a challenge in keeping up with health and safety regulations. We have major commitments in facilities through facilities renewal funds and school condition index, but we often find ourselves short of operating dollars to address our ongoing health and safety needs. Combined, that represents a net increase of about $1.8 million in operating budgets. Mr. Chair, I think I'll just take a pause there. I think those are the highlights of where we're at. And with your indulgence, I'll just quickly review how we got here, where we're positioned now, and what our next steps will be. I think this year in particular, we have seen the benefits of working in a district that is truly a community of character. Everyone around this room has been engaged in budget discussions, formal and informal. Everyone has been involved in the student learning and accommodation process. We have managed to make recommendations. The board has made difficult decisions, and for the most part, we have been able to do that in a manner that respects these attributes. We believe it's important to remind people that we are a community of character, and I know that even though this budget on the face of it is not as difficult as some of the ones we've seen in the last 2 and 3 years, I would remind members of the committee that we will certainly make better progress in our debates, our discussions, if we can keep these attributes in mind. Again, you've all seen this before. Our staff recommended budget is really based on a combination of the Government of Ontario's funding and priorities, the input that we receive through trustees from the public, formally and informally, whether it's when we go out to school council meetings, when we attend advisory committees, the things that we hear as we work through policy discussions. Those all help inform it. We know that we're working within the ministry's multi-year financial recovery plan, and we do have some specific local needs. Staff always has been trying to work to align the budget more closely with our 5 strategic goals. We think that we've been able to do that this year. We've been able to invest in staff that will strongly support our goals, all 5 of these goals. We hope that the additional dollars that we've received from the province for facilities renewal and school condition index will allow us to improve and meet some of our goals with respect to stewardship. So we believe we've made progress. There's still ways to go with it, but we do believe, and we have worked at every one of our budget meetings, the strategic priorities we've managed to keep in front of us to try to remind us why and how we're making some of these decisions. I think you've seen this surplus amount before. Our accumulated surplus is projected at the end of 16-17 to be approximately $4.5 million. Again, as we talked about this through the budget, we started with an estimate of having to find at least $1.8 million in reductions. We talked about the fact that as time went on, we could see negative impacts in the grants. Those were offset by the positive impact of our increased enrollment. We knew that we've seen inflationary pressures that we have not really been addressing properly in the last couple of years. We had thought that we would need to be providing an additional $1 million in staff replacement costs. And we set an initial target of trying to find savings that would allow us to make a reinvestment in our system infrastructure. And when I say that, I include the people side of the business. We thought at the end of January we were looking for $5.8 million. You will remember that when we came forward in April, that target had changed to 4.6. We identified that, in fact, the grant assumptions would be somewhat better. The board had already approved academic staffing changes in the total of about 1.3 million. We had identified a small change in our facility consolidation savings. But when we looked in January 2017, we found that we needed to add an additional $500,000 if we were going to cover our staff replacement costs. In addition, by then we had received OSPD's projection for next year, identifying in their mind an additional $1.2 million in transportation costs, some of which were tied to contract increases, some of which were tied to the increased transportation costs as a result of school closures and the consolidation of our 7 and 8 programs into secondary schools. It's always important for us when we begin talking about the budget to be aware of the risks that we take on. Probably the biggest risk is enrollment variability, since the vast majority of our funding does come on a per pupil basis. If we're wrong on projections, that changes our funding. If we have over-projected enrollment and fewer students are counted at October 31st and March 31st, we will not have enough revenue to cover the costs in the budget. As we always discuss, planning and staff have done a good job in those projections. In 2016, 2017, I think we were fairly open with the Budget Committee that we thought we had been conservative in those budget estimates, but that there was a potential, should the students appear and be counted in October, that we could add staff to respond to those needs, and we in fact did that. There's always fluctuations in revenues and expenses. We know that as we look through some of those miscellaneous revenues, by themselves, they aren't material when you look at a $900 million budget. However, when you're working on a knife's edge like we are, $500,000 here and another $500,000 there, and all of a sudden that's the equivalent of 10 jobs. The other thing we need to be aware of are things like in-year pressures to meet emerging needs. And I guess the simplest example I can give of that, the government announced today an increase in minimum wage, effective January 1st to $14, something that I think we're all pleased to see. I can tell you that we have not received any indication from the province that we would be receiving additional dollars to cover that increase. And we do have a significant number of our casual staff whose compensation will be impacted by that. So that's one of those budget risks. You try to manage it as the year goes on, but I do think it's an example of why we as staff are conservative in developing the budget. Mr. Chair, jumping ahead to the slide number 12, we wanted to give you the history of our enrollments. You'll note that we saw in 2016-17 a significant increase, as I said, about roughly 600 kids in the elementary panel. In the secondary panel, we saw a slight increase of about 200. That generated the new dollars for us. When we looked at 17-18, and I can tell you I sat in on a lot of the meetings with planning as we looked at these projections. We need to take a look at the demographics of the city. We need to take a look at the expectations of other school districts. And when we did this at the end of November, the beginning of December, we were mindful of the fact that we are seeing and hearing from some communities that have been disrupted by student accommodation. How much of that will happen? We're not sure. So we have projected a slight decline in average daily enrollment. If in fact that doesn't occur, we'll be in the situation that we were in the fall. Additional teachers will be hired. Where appropriate, we'll hire additional supports for students. But we find that this is the appropriate way for us to build our recommendation to you. We do not believe it would be prudent to have been more aggressive in these projections, but we think that these are realistic and they're targets that have allowed us to go forward and organize our schools for the next year. As we said, by the time you factor in the increase in enrollment, you factor in all of the new money associated with the compensation increases, the local priorities funding, as well as the additional funding for employee benefits as a result of the trusts, we see in this district an increase of over 7% in our gross revenues and expenditures. Some important things to look at. We've talked about revenue. We have some increased revenues for fee-based services, whether it's childcare, whether it's our community use. Again, on their own, none of them are windfalls, but they have helped us significantly. The GSNs contained enhanced funding for our collective agreement obligations with respect to benefits. It did provide additional dollars, recognizing the increase in school facilities operating costs. Perhaps most visible to us is the significantly increased funding that we received for facilities renewal, school condition index, and our greenhouse gas initiatives. It's one of those ones that is wonderful news. If I put on my other hat for a moment, we are looking at how we can get that work done effectively, efficiently, make sure we get the best value for the dollar with the existing staff complement that we have. But we do believe that is achievable, and we have built our budget around that. The local priorities funding we've talked about, and that is primarily staffing, and we are pleased that those dollars have come through. It has certainly made this budget less of a bad news document than it might otherwise have been. Significant changes. We know that we've talked about the academic staffing, the changes that came about strictly as a result of student learning and accommodation. We've talked about having to put additional dollars in for staff replacement, transportation costs, and our investment in health and safety. We also have been able to identify, and I talked about it briefly in terms of the increase in positions. We had identified over the course of the years, and I think trustees will understand this, every time we tried to understand some of our variances with respect to replacement costs for staff, especially when it came to ECEs, we often wrestled in finance, why can't we get the exact dollar figure for sick leave replacement to balance to what the payroll system is telling us people are taking as sick days? What we were able to identify was that the original budgets had been underestimated in terms of the number of full-time equivalents, so that we were in fact running with more staff that were in the budget. It was being accommodated in year, and we were managing it, but we have been able to adjust that base and correct it, so that in fact we have now included the approximately 32 positions and the dollars for those of early childhood educators that should have been in the base budget. That has been accommodated. There are other schedules that show the detail, but I think it's important to note that as opposed to previous years, the district is seeing a net increase in the number of positions over the 2016-17 budget of approximately 136. I think it's important that we repeat a number of those. The local priorities positions, 86 3/4, are being funded under the local priorities funding, which as far as we know is 2-year funding. We all will continue to press the government to ensure that we don't have a hard end to that, but for now we need to look through the next 2 years to make sure we support children effectively. The increase in staffing, This chart briefly shows you the percentage increase to see the change. We have a very small decline in plant support staff, and that's really the result of the reduction of 6 schools. Means that we were actually in a position to reduce chief custodians, and that was part of the extension agreements and the collective agreements. Again, Mr. Chair, I'm going to go through this quickly. These are detail pages that support the other changes that we have made in terms of where the changes came from, the previously approved changes. I think people have seen them, but it is important to note that these were recommendations that came about either through the school accommodation process or our academic staffing, and they were the changes that we would have been required to otherwise make, with the exception of local priorities funding. We understand that we haven't finalized the exact numbers associated with the local priorities fund, but in general, we have been able to, while it isn't always an exact one-for-one reinstatement of a position that was reduced, we have been able to increase the number of staff across the board. Finally, Mr. Chair, I'll bring people back to our final slide. That is the remaining parts of our budget process. Obviously, tonight we're presenting the budget. I'm sure there will be some questions. We also know that people will need time to digest what's in the budget binder, what's in this presentation, and the letter of transmittal. Next week is available for delegations, if they're required, and the debate by the committee. And then we have meetings scheduled for the 12th, 19th, and 26th as they're required. I think, Mr. Chair, we've done our best to try to, in the budget binder, summarize some of these decisions. Certainly, if trustees or members of the committee have detailed questions, we will continue the question and answer process that we followed in the past. If those are directed to myself and or Mr. Gardner, will consolidate them. We will do our best to provide answers at each of the upcoming meetings where possible. And if there are some questions tonight, we might be able to deal with them orally and get them out of the way. I think, Mr. Chair, there are some that we already have in the works. There were some that we considered budget questions that had arisen during, could have been during the discussion around special education and gifted, but we already have a couple that are in the works. But I would ask the committee, if you do have questions, by all means, we'll do our best to get a response to you as quickly as possible to support that decision making. So, Mr. Chair, I think I'll end there. I'm sorry it took so long, but I think we do need to, we were hoping to summarize some of the highlights of this discussion.
Thank you, CFO Carson. Very, very comprehensive budget document. And now we're going to open the floor for questions. We're going to put the time at 3 minutes because it's a committee and we can ask multiple questions. So we'll start off with Trustee Kavanaugh.
Thank you. I'm just going to go over a couple of things that you talked about tonight. One of them is related to cuts that were made last time. We made a lot of cuts, and now we're reintegrating something, and that was on the professional development, where you've mentioned about 400,000. This is on folio 37, and the 330. So that's a big one in terms of what happened there, in terms of how did we see, it's just, you know, is this lessons learned? Because when you make cuts that really don't, from what you're saying, were not worth it, as it were. So can you give me some background on that?
Mr. Chair, there's two parts to it. Over the last 2 years, we had eliminated the equivalent of 2.5 days, an average of 2.5 days of professional learning for every teacher in the system. When we went through the process, though, we found that we just weren't able to reduce that much because it was decentralized so much. The adjustment going through curriculum services was that that is the largest single source of professional development dollars, but there are others that flow through not just the operating budget, but also through the education programs other. and other professional development that occurs in the district, whether it's through LSS or some of our other initiatives that the province has funded. We found that in order to actually capture all of the savings we identified last year, we were going to hamstring the system, and we believe it's important to reinstate that $730,000.
Okay, thank you. The other question I had was to do with transportation. $1.2 million is a hefty sum as well, and this is related to the fact that we're closing schools and we're moving kids around. How can we justify to the public that kind of figure for something like that? And is there any possibility that that can be whittled down at all, like in terms of, for example, you know, smaller versus bigger buses, or bus passes versus yellow buses? These are all OSTA decisions, of course, but I just want to, you know, get my head around that. That's a big chunk. Thanks.
Mr. Chair, the transportation piece, the 1.2, part of it is the increased cost as a result of school closures. Some of it is contractual. I think we need to remember there is one portion of this is the transitional dollars, where we made a decision that we would provide bus passes to some students that would not normally be eligible for a period of time to assist with their transition to Gloucester High School. I think that this is an issue that all school boards have raised with the ministry. If you reduce the number of schools, on average, you're going to increase distances, and that you will have more people that are eligible for transportation. This year was particularly challenging because the conversion of schools to a 7 to 12 model means that you have to create transportation for grades 7s and 8 students in a boundary where there wouldn't be transportation for the secondary students, just because of the increase of the distance. As a result, we have a number of those students in 7 and 8 who will be receiving Presto passes. That's the bulk of it. I think as we go forward, you will see when you're moving kids from one elementary school to an elementary school, there is less of a financial impact because you do have vehicles that are already there, and you can more effectively route them. And the final part of it is that the additional cost, or the savings, the net savings that come out of this, are one piece of the puzzle. The most important reason we proceeded with student learning and accommodation reviews was to make sure that we could offer the programs that every student deserved at the right number of schools, make sure that we made the best use of our resources. When you look at it on its own merit, though, strictly by itself, on a dollars and cents basis, we heard it during the review and we did respond to it. The dollars and cents by themselves do not drive that. We have spoken with OSTA, and they are looking at alternatives in the future, and I think as we go forward, we will need to look at different ways to try to minimize that additional transportation cost.
Thank you. I think we have to be prepared to justify it, because I think people, obviously they raised it a lot when their schools were closing, and so I think we have to be prepared to show the counterbalance if there's been savings because of the schools, so be prepared for that. Thank you.
Trustee Kavanaugh, did I hear that you would move the recommendation onto the floor for discussion?
All right, I will.
Very much.
All right, thanks.
We have a seconder. Trustee Boothby. All right, Trustee Schwartz.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a couple questions on within the binder on folio 37. So both of the questions I have relate to fundraising that parents have to do in our schools. And I have some concern about 5% reduction in school operating budgets, and actually what the implications of that is for our parent population for the fundraising that they actually have to do in the schools. And so just from the operating budget perspective, can you walk us through what a typical school operating budget consists of, and whether or not parents would have to make up that 5% difference, for example?
Sorry, Mr. Chair. The factors that we use in setting the school operating budget, my colleagues are reminding me, are on page 125. More importantly, though, this 5% reduction to school budgets will be more than offset for nearly every school by the fact that we're relieving them of the obligation of covering any over expenditures with their share of occasional teachers and replacement time for ECEs. What has been the practice for at least the last 20 years was that we had decentralized the first 10 days, I believe, of an absence were to be covered at the school. I don't remember all of the rules exactly. When those schools went into a deficit on their occasional teacher line, they were required to cover that cost out of their own operating budget. As a result, we reached a stage where probably 2/3 of our schools were carrying deficits. What we decided that we would do is schools will still see a budget for occasional teachers. They'll still see the expenses associated with it, because it's important to us that the principal be aware of what's happening in their school and be able to work with staff to try to control those costs where possible. But the negative impact of that variance we're going to bear centrally. So in fact, most schools should be in a better position than they are this year. And we have said to principals that where that isn't the case, we will work with them. I think there's no doubt. I can't name one, but I'm sure there will be 2 or 3 where this will have more of an impact on them than others. And we'll work with the superintendents, and we'll work with some of our supplementary sources of funding to make sure that kids aren't disadvantaged.
Okay, but when I look on page 125, in terms of the description of the school budget allocations, the asterisks also are under field trips, team transportation, so on, which indicates that includes that 5% decrease. So again, my question is the expectation then that parents actually will make up that shortfall? So as a parent of a child in the elementary school system, certainly I've seen an increase as a parent in the costs related to things like field trips and so on, and transportation costs for those field trips. I have concern for the schools and the parent communities who frankly don't have a school council and don't have fundraising opportunities. What happens to a school like Carson Grove where, you know, they want to go out on field trips but can't because they don't have the money in the school operating budget because of a reduction?
Mr. Chair, I'll say it again, I think we're going to find that nearly every school will have more dollars available as a result of this change, because they will no longer have to squirrel away dollars out of their own operating budget to cover OT costs. Having said that, there may be some schools that are in a unique situation where that isn't the case, and we will work with it. If a school continues to see increased costs around field trips and being unable to manage it, again, superintendents of instruction work with the schools to try to see how they can manage that, but that will not be as a result of this reduction.
Okay, that's helpful just to have that reiterated, because I think it is, the parent community will look at things like that and think that they have to make up a shortfall. The other question that I have in the last remaining minutes is related to the mobile devices for students and that cost. One of my schools in particular has raised this, that they've done enormous efforts in their fundraising for computer equipment in the school. How will this money potentially help them? But they also feel, frankly, that the board hasn't really helped them, so they've had to do their own fundraising in order to ensure that there is computer equipment in the schools. So I don't know if my question is clear.
I think it is. I'll jump in and I'll start with a response. To be frank, $700,000 in a district our size is a very, very tiny amount of money. And we thought it was absolutely critical that we put at least a sum like that as a reinvestment. We know that school councils do fundraise, and some of the things that they fundraise for are mobile devices, and it's a huge support to the schools. This puts it back on the table, saying we have a responsibility to be contributing to those devices. If we were going to take over and not have to have anything happening, it would have to be a much, much larger amount of money. So we thought that this was a reasonable amount. We started off in our discussions as senior staff with a much higher number, and it ended up being that we thought this was the reasonable amount to go forward. But we think that this is a step in the right direction, but it certainly will not provide the number of devices that should be in our systems.
Again, I just want to reiterate, I think the monies ought to be, and I hope that the monies are actually going to be spent for schools that don't have school councils doing the kind of fundraising, or don't actually have a school council to be able to raise money for mobile devices, and as an example.
You have the ability to differentiate and certainly take a look at those kinds of factors, as well as overall enrollment, etc.
Thank you very much. Trustee Fisher.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. And just very quickly, and just some general comments on the budget. Overall, I think I'd like the macro direction of the budget. We're on track for our multi-year plan, which is always important for me. However, as I've said in years past, you know, there's 100 plus pages here of numbers, and something that I often struggle with is that you know, when I look at these numbers, you know, they're inputs, and when I try to correlate what we're trying to do with those inputs in terms of our strategic plan and looking specifically at outcomes and outputs, I have some big questions in terms of what we're actually trying to achieve here, and three specifically. One, I continue to hear a lot from parents in terms about assessment and placement and delays around assessment, and in addition, access to learning supports, particularly technology. I'd like to get a better sense of how we're trying to address those kind of issues in this budget. As well, we've often talked as a board around our O&M backlog. Are we actually getting ahead? Are we making ground with this budget in terms of the challenges that we've seen in our O&M backlog? And I guess thirdly, and I've heard this year more than any other year, some real concerns about learning supports in the classroom and issues around behavior. And I'd like to get a better sense. Obviously, we're reinvesting into frontline staff, particularly EAs. I'd like to get a better sense from staff how this budget is addressing some of those critical issues that we as trustees are continuing to hear increasingly on the ground. And so you've given us a good picture of the macro picture. Tell me a little bit about how this budget responds to some of those key pressures that we hear so much about on the ground. Thank you.
I think I'll start off with the special education piece, and I'll hand it over to Superintendent Grigoriev. And one of the things that we'll highlight in the points is the fact with the local priorities coming in from the extension agreements did specify additional staff for special education, both in the education worker category as well in the teacher category. And I'll hand it over to the superintendent, the two superintendents, HR and LSS, to talk a little bit about what that will look like.
Thank you. There are a number of initiatives that are being undertaken and proposed for this budget, but I do want to start by referring to the assessments and the wait lists. Wait lists have actually been reduced for assessments, the wait time, and you'll be getting that information shortly via memo through our annual memo. So you'll see a reduction over time of wait lists for professional services. In terms of the behaviors, so we have increased funding for BMS training, which will help in a proactive manner to support high needs behaviors in classes. As well, there has been the increase of EAs, which will be supportive of behaviors as well.
Bill Carson for the backlog question.
Mr. Chair, we have a backlog about $700 million. The combination of school condition index money and the enhanced facilities renewal money that we received last year and this year will allow us to, in total it comes to about $50 to $60 million, and that will allow us to stay ahead of where we are. The other improvement that we will see at some point over the course of this budget is that of the 6 elementary schools that we closed, when they're disposed of, that by itself will reduce that backlog by approximately anywhere between $40 and $50 million, which is about a 5% increase to the total. So we're making some progress. I think it's clear from the way that the province has been committing dollars over the last 5 years in particular. They are committing a substantial amount of funding to boards to work with their existing stock of buildings, in some cases at the expense of those of us also looking for new schools.
Okay, thanks. That's really helpful. I think at the start of this budget process, one of the things that we might want to consider, and I thought we've done this in year past, but it would be really helpful for me to really get a better sense about what the departmental priorities are for this year. What are some of the critical system issues that we're trying to address with this budget? Because again, when I look at this, there's a lot of numbers here, and I'm really trying to get a better sense of outcomes and outputs and where we want to be at the end of the year. And obviously some of these investments are multi-year investments. They're on a continuum, and we're trying to strive towards a certain outcome over a number of years. But it would help me get a better feel for what exactly we're trying to do with this budget. And I don't see that in here. There's a lot of good information, but I don't see that critical piece in terms of where we're trying to get to with this budget.
Mr. Chair, I think it's a good point. One of the challenges systems have is trying to link specific inputs to the outputs. I think what we have tried to do this year is to try to minimize the impact of reductions and to try to maintain and consolidate some of the progress that we had made with respect to student achievement. We continue to perform well provincially, and we continue to be recognized globally for that. In terms of specific outcome measures, we do have a ways to go. We wish we could point to, for example, the investment that we've made in payroll systems. What's the outcome of that? Can that reduce the workload at school offices? We're not there yet. But we certainly understand what the trustee is saying. As much as we're trying to align them with the strategic objectives, in an ideal world, it would be good to be able to show the straight line between the initial objective, the work we're doing, and the dollars we're committing, and then seeing how that rolls out. We understand it. We're not there yet.
Yeah, I appreciate that, and I guess the best example for me is learning support services, and obviously we spend a lot of time, we spend a lot of money in that area, and it's money well spent. But I would like to know from one year to the next if we, for example, have a wait time of X and we have support personnel of Y to be able to help deliver those services. If we're proposing in a budget, an investment. Where is that ultimately trying to get us at the end of the year in terms of a change in terms of that waste list, or an improvement in that delivery? I can't see that in this budget. All I see is a big number and a lot of staff, right? I can't feel what the outcome or the output is that we're trying to drive towards, and that's I think important for all of us to understand.
Thank you very much, Trustee Fisher. Trustee Menard.
Thanks very much, Mr. Chair. Just a few things that I've noticed. Just going through the binder initially, sort of three themes. One is around the local priorities funding that's been received, which is tremendous, and congratulations to the folks that negotiated those deals, because that's going to help our district a lot. The second is around the effect of school closures on our operating budgets, which turns out to be relatively low in the grand scheme of things. If $700,000 is a drop in the bucket, well, we're talking about 2 or 3 drops in the bucket here. So it's important to keep in mind going forward in terms of school closures how little an effect actually this has on our operating budgets overall. The third point is around, outside of the local priorities funding and the school closures, the recommended changes in staffing as well as our operating budgets are interesting, right? What we're doing is essentially transferring a lot centrally, and I think we've been sort of there's been discussion around this, that this is going to be coming, but if you look at the changes in staffing, we have reductions to frontline staff, again, outside of the local priorities, outside of the school closures. We have reductions to staff, but increases centrally going up in both the staffing and operating budgets of it. So I think it's important we look at that fairly closely. In one example, BNLT is going up 15% in their operating budget all in 1 year. 15% increase there. So I think it's important to look at those in detail, and I mean, we just got this, but it's going to be important. There's a few other things I wanted to mention. The changes in office staff. So we had cuts through the school closures to office staff initially, and then on top of that, we're also looking at, I believe, another 4.5 and 2 cuts into office staff. I just remember hearing last year how dire that situation was initially, so I'm a little uncomfortable going that deep on office staff again. I just want to mention that. I do have a question about the OT budget. The OT budget, we've been hearing over and over and over again this year how crazy it is in terms of going overboard. So can you just clarify, that's being moved centrally, and how much of an increase are we budgeting for the OT budget?
So I'll start off with the OT budget, and then I'll pass it over to CFO. A couple of things. So we are moving right now, currently those dollars are at the school level, and if they overspend their allocation in OT, then they have to eat into their school supplies budget. We've certainly heard lots and lots of concerns over that, and we're at a point now that most of our schools are in deficit. And so something that came from the principal and vice principal rep group was to a request to pull that out so that principals actually are able to manage the budgets that they're doing. So that idea of the first 10 days will be paid for centrally. And so that reduction of 5% is just, those dollars are moving centrally so that we'll be looking after that, and principals will have a better sense of what they have to be able to be dedicating to things like purchase of textbooks, purchase of supplies, all the kinds of things that they use their school budget for. So that's one piece of it. When we look at our incident rate, we have talked up until this point in time about the idea that we thought that we would need another $1.5 million to cover the actual projected increase in costs for replacement of not only teachers but ECEs and ECEs and EAs. And we've brought that number down, and that's why it's 700,000 compared to 1.5 million. And that's on a bit of a hopeful stance that the work that we are doing with the unions together collaboratively will have a positive impact on the occurrences, and that we will be able to get those numbers down. And so instead of putting 1.5 million, which meant that we've dropped that down by 800,000, and that 800,000 means that we're not making a recommendation to essentially cut another 16 positions. So it's, I think, in all of our best interests, we're taking a bit of a leap of faith, and we're hoping that the work that we're all going to do together, I think we're all committed to it, and we're hoping that that'll have a positive impact, and we won't have made the wrong decision there. But that's why the number has changed from 1.5 to 700,000.
Well, I'm happy to hear that. I mean, looking at the audit numbers just from last week, we're actually under budget. We have budgeted 16.1 million last year, and we're only spending 15.9 on OT costs. So I'm really happy to hear we're not going to go, you know, another 1.5. I know there's a trend there, and certainly we have to account for the trend, but our audit numbers are showing a projected amount that's lower than what we budgeted for last year, so I think it's important to mention on that. So I mean, 700,000, I hope we're even lower than that, but.
We tend to, just on that, we tend to have much higher rates in the months of May and June than earlier in the year, and so we're hoping that we'll be on track, but we'll see what the end of the year results are.
Okay, thanks for that. And I think I had about a minute left. I don't know, and I'll go back on the list too. Okay. So a couple other things that I just wanted to mention quickly. You had mentioned that the social worker position that exists now is vacant at this time. Why is that?
CFO Carson?
We always have positions that are coming and go. I don't know the details of it, but when we took a look at those positions that were vacant, when we considered, the positions that were eligible, when we had to make reductions, we looked at those positions that were vacant and that would meet the test of attrition. I have to go back and see how long. I think it was, if I remember, these were vacant positions as of around the middle of April when we first did it. I'd have to go back and research it. We'll add that to our Q&As.
Okay, thanks for that. The other couple, I guess, just quickly, really quick things. The ECEs not being accounted for in our core program. I'm a bit confused about that. There's I think it was 32 ECEs. That's a ton of individual FTEs not accounted for. And you had mentioned something in the presentation, but are we sure that we're getting all our FTEs straight now? And I guess what happened and how long was that going on for? I mean, obviously our budget had enough room that we were accounting for it and we were okay. But that's a lot of FTEs not to have accounted for in the core program previously.
Mr. Chair, in the budget, it's not 32 full-time positions that weren't there. There's the gap between, as we allocated the time between the core day and the full and extended day. What was missing was the hour of overlap, roughly an hour of overlap. That created those positions. Where we were trying to sort ourselves out, and this is what's complicated the whole discussion about replacement costs, when we found ourselves consistently over on the actual side compared to the budget, we drove deeper, and that's where we were able to identify it wasn't necessarily sick leave, it was the fact that we were looking at budget dollars that had not been allocated. And so that's why, in addition to being a little more aggressive in our expectations for sick leave next year, if you think of it, and I'm trying not to be too simplistic, we were starting off $2 million in the hole for ECEs if everything else was perfect. When we would go through those analyses and we try to identify what is the difference, some of that was where are we putting the replacement costs, how does that sit in, so that we believe we've now got that right. It came about because of the way full-day kindergarten was being phased in over the 5-year period, as well as the changes in the operation of extended day. I think the reason we found it this time around was the effort we've put in trying to isolate those replacement costs, because as we said last year when we were having the budget discussion, and as staff have been looking at the trends, we need to make sure that we can effectively match those dollars.
So you're saying that because some ECEs work in both the EDP and the core program, so you're saying that in their transition from, say, EDP to the core, there's an overlap of time there that we weren't accounting for, and that's where we missed out the equivalent of 32 ECEs.
Mr. Chair, the budget was built on how many hours do you need for the 2 EDP programs, how many hours do you need for the core day. The fact is that in a number of our programs we have an ECE that will start at 7 o'clock in the morning, work through till 1 p.m. or 2. I I'm being corrected, 2. And then you'll have the afternoon ECE that's working probably beginning at noon till 6. So it's that overlap that we budgeted for. What's the minimum if you're staffing the most efficient use of full-time and part-time? Because we had a larger number of full-timers, we in fact were running a higher cost on the other end. And we knew we were doing that because it was one of our recruitment strategies, was to stay away from part-time staffing where we could. We knew recruitment would be difficult enough. So we have got it right this year, and we've been able to include it in the budget, and it's part of the recommendation that gets us to a balanced budget.
Is that in the EDP budget or the overall ECE budget?
No, this is the core day.
Core day. Okay, thanks.
It should be, just on that point, it should be noted that our district chooses to overstaff in that core day for a period. There's that overlap period. We're not required to have that overlap period. We do that so that it's good working conditions for the ECs where they're not having to do split shifts and they're going right through. And then it means in our kindergarten programs, we've got double the ECEs for that 1 hour period.
And I think that's good. I just did the amount of money that's coming in as a result is just significant. So, okay, thanks, Mr. Chair, and I'll stay on the list if that's okay.
Can I go to the bottom of the list, Trustee Munner? Okay. Trustee Seward?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to staff for putting together this budget under stringent time constraints. I'd like to deal with a specific issue, and then if I have time, I'd like to talk about a general need that I think we have in the board. The specific issue is with respect to accommodation reviews. We did 2 in the last year, the Eastern and the Western reviews. We're doing another very big one now, starting in September, but we've already had an information session on that. So I think it's fair to say that staff and trustees and the general public that are associated with us are spending a huge proportion of time on accommodation reviews. And we all know the reasons for those reviews. The learning objective from my point of view is a key reason, but also the financial imperative for doing this, the fact that we're actually losing money from the province for top-up funding. So if you look at page 33 in the budget binder, it says here, and I assume that this is for both the Eastern and the Western review, that the savings are calculated at about 2.4 million for the 2 reviews that we conducted this year. Elsewhere in the letter of transmittal, it says of that amount, we only expect the savings for 2017-18 to be about 1.2, which is half of the amount. I know that some of the money that we would have saved, we reinvested in Rideau, so I'm aware of that. But I'd like to understand what are the other factors that are taken into consideration by staff that reduces the amount of savings by 50%.
Mr. Chair, there's a couple of pieces. The first is transportation, which we've discussed. The added transportation costs are a big piece of it. The other is that on this sheet we have shown the savings, but we haven't factored in the actual grant reductions associated with it. We did a document during the school accommodation process. We'll dig that out and we'll recirculate it because, for example, we're showing on this page the savings of the reductions of principals of 659,000. That's offset almost entirely by the reduction in the school foundation grant, so that when we do this process, there are positions that were specifically funded and we lose those grants. So we'll go back and dig out what we had done in February or March and recirculate that. I think it gives a better picture of where we're at.
So we're talking about net savings after we factor out the revenue reductions.
The revenue and that additional, the portion of transportation expenses that are required to facilitate it.
Madam Chair, the only other thing that's not on this page is, of course, the deferral of the facilities renewal dollars, and I think CFO Carson said that it was about $40 to $50 million worth.
Mr. Chair, in addition to the operating budget savings, what we realized was those positions that we were able to reallocate more effectively to support the remaining school buildings, and in addition, as we said during the meetings, the ability to focus fairly scarce dollars coming from facilities renewal, et cetera, on the remaining buildings. The total backlog associated with those elementary schools, as I said, I don't have it in front of me, but it's probably somewhere between $35 and $45 million. And those, it's not that we'd have spent all that money in 10 years because we're so far behind, but it certainly has allowed us to focus the dollars on the remaining buildings, and as opposed to spreading the dollars too thinly.
Hey, I think, Madam Director, I may have lost a little time, but I'm sure you'll fix it for me. Related to that point, we already have a number of empty buildings in this board, some big, some small, and we don't, I think, try to sell them very quickly. Should we be placing more priority on moving those buildings so that we not only save maintenance costs for buildings that we already have that have been empty for some time, but also so that the money that we get from those sales we can reinvest in the board? So how aggressive can we be? Perhaps we should be more aggressive than we've been in the past. I'd appreciate a staff comment on that.
Mr. Chair, staff will be bringing, we said during the accommodation reviews, we'd be bringing forward our recommendations for disposition in the fall. In terms of being aggressive, we can certainly talk about it. Publicly, I have no problem saying that we know that, for example, Parkwood Hills makes up part of a contiguous arrangement, and we have used it from time to time for swing space. McGregor Easton was closed 5 or 6 years ago. It was recently rented to the, I think it was the French Public Board, and we have tried to support the community. That's one that I think we will be re-examining the need for and moving ahead with. We have, we had postponed it because the province had was in the process of changing its disposition regulation, but we'll be bringing our recommendations forward this fall.
Well, that'll be very helpful. I love playing Monopoly, and I understand the importance of keeping properties, but we're in difficult times, and I'd rather see the finances that would come to that reinvested in our own schools. And then I think, Mr. Chair, I have another few seconds because the clock didn't work. Is that true? Oh, so I'm, okay, one last thing. It's an observation. Throughout the year, we receive really good reports from staff measuring the results of our work on our strategic objectives of equity, knowledge, engagement, and that kind of thing. And I think in those documents, there is a story that could be attached to this budget. And I would really like to see that narrative story. It doesn't have to be more than 4 or 5 pages, explaining why we're investing in certain areas, why we're reinvesting in some areas that we have been relatively neglecting, and so on. In other words, a narrative that can attach the budget document to what we are trying to achieve as a public education board. And I really hope that we can return to that. You don't have to put me on the bottom of the list now, but I would love to see that kind of brief narrative report tied to this quantitative budget. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Trustee Seward. Trustee Bronwyn.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you to staff for this wonderful binder. I look forward to delving into it later this week. Many of my questions have been asked. I will also say I'm very much looking forward to finding out how long we've had a social work position vacant for and what's going on there. But I also have a bit of a soapbox rant, which is that every time we talk about overspending in special education, it kind of catches in my ear. And I'm wondering if there's a way that we can start talking about being underfunded in special education rather than overspending in that envelope, because I don't know that special education is something where we're, spending, like, to see, $5 million, almost $6 million and saying that we've put too much and that, that the province would expect us to put $6 million less into special education. I think that that's probably the wrong way to look at that, and I think we need to flip that on its head and talk about it as being underfunded rather than overspent.
Mr. Chair, I think that's the way we approach it when we speak to the ministry. It's we try to put it in perspective of the percentage increase, the percentage of overspending or underfunding, as we say. There are several boards in this province, large and small, where that percentage gap is much larger. We've made that argument on a number of these areas, and I think it's something that the advocacy committee can continue to talk about.
Thank you very much. Well done. Trustee Scott?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think I better start with one of the easy questions with a short answer, I hope. And that is on folio 4 of our agenda material, the package that came on Friday, talking about the multi-year financial recovery plan. I understand that staff have been talking to ministry staff about this and are feeling reasonably good about it. I guess the question I have is, when are we going to actually have some sense of what the multi-year plan actually looks like with this budget? Because I'm not totally seeing that in the pieces of the budget I've had a chance to look at so far.
Mr. Chair, we actually asked the ministry this week in terms of, can we write them and tell them we want that extension, and will they give us that answer? And they said, no, we don't want to look at it until the fall, until we've seen the 2016-17 financial statements. What this does, this budget brings us to that $4.5 million we had identified of a surplus, which means that we're on target for where we're going. 2018-19 is where they wanted the surplus to increase again. We're saying to them that we may need an additional year, depending on what happens with funding in that 18-19 year. We've certainly seen a change in their approach, I think it's fair to say, in the last 6 months. I think the progress that has been made by the district as a whole, the board in its budget decisions and staff in implementing that budget, has increased the ministry's confidence in where we're going. But I don't think we're going to see anything more formal from the province until the fall.
Yeah, I guess what I'd like to see is staff just lay it out in terms of where we are now and where we think, or at least where we think we are now and where we think that we're going to be a year from now. In other words, why would we need the extension? How have we done? And just look at the several years experience that we've already had in terms of the changes we've been making. If that is possible to do in a very abbreviated fashion.
Mr. Chair, we'll be able to provide a summary. We'll add that to the Q&As.
That would be very helpful. Second thing I wanted to raise was the tie-in to the strategic plan, because this is one thing that I think is really, really important. There are sort of somewhat references to it scattered here and there in the letter of transmittal, but what I'm not seeing here is any clear linkage of the various investments to particular elements of the strategic plan. For example, when we look at some of the central staff that are being proposed to be added, I would have seen those as sort of a pieces of good stewardship. We have to maintain our infrastructure to keep the whole system running properly and address some of those needs. There are clearly some things that tie to well-being, others that tie specifically to continuing to work to support students' achievement and well-being. But I'm not seeing any sort of summary page for that. I'm not sure that it would actually take a ton of pages to do it, but somewhere I would like to see the list of significant initiatives and what aspects of our strat plan they support. Is that possible?
That's certainly reasonable. We can do that.
Thank you for that. And the other thing I wanted to do was to go back to page 127 in the budget, looking at the school budgets. I frankly, when I look at this, I don't understand this page at all compared to what I've seen in previous years relative to how we develop and allocate school budgets. This may take a little bit of time, Mr. Chair, so I'd be happy to go back on the list after other people have spoken and deal with this then.
Thank you, Trustee Scott. That's appreciated. Ms. Handela.
Thank you very much. I'm very impressed at the range of comments and questions coming out of the trustees. I always am, but the comments that we've heard from parents over the course of this year are being echoed in your words, and so a lot of comments I'd like to raise will support that. As a starting point, looking at this document from a transparency perspective, I think there are two areas that we have an opportunity. The transportation costs, yet again, and this has been raised at every budget meeting, we have very little transportation cost transparency for our parents to understand how much the spending is impacting choices. On page 17 of the presentation, early childhood educators are referenced from a change year over year, but I note that I think I'm understanding that there are 3 streams of staff represented in this number: core, extended day, and child care programs. I think it's actually quite untenable to present these 3 in this way. At minimum, the child care programs should be removed. They are a different population than our general parents and should not be reflected in this change. I recognize that budgeting is overall, but this is an area that could skew an understanding. With that in mind, the consultation and communications issues were something that we mentioned at the very first budget Cal meeting, that the section that's has been consistently in the report has basically said information is available to parents. We raised the issue then that parents need to be able to understand why they should care. You understand how to run your business, you understand what you think is important. We are asking and giving parents opportunities to comment, yet how do they wade through all of this without understanding the strategic importance, the outcomes and objectives, the goals and the trade-offs that you are all going to make as decisions? That isn't here. So as that 4 or 5 page note is prepared per Trustee Scott or Trustee Fisher or Trustee Seward's comments, we need to take the lens of, if a parent is going to comment and have an opinion, how would they know a choice is being made that's impacting their students? So that is sort of the overarching comment. I may ask to go back on the list. I'm just sort of going to go through my other notes, but I think that's our big picture. This is not transparent to parents at all. It's going to be hard, but I think we could add a little bit of improvement on that.
Thank you. Ms. Dout?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think that Trustee Fisher's point trying to understand the benefits of the spec ed and where the money is being spent is well taken. I think there's a lot of things don't really show up in this sort of budget. For instance, one of the things that's happened over the last year, has been happening over the last year, is that an increased number of children have had access to the Empower program for reading, and this has provided them with an equity to other students in terms of their learning how to read now, finally. Additionally, so SEAC has been concerned, has mentioned its concern on several occasions about services in the regular classroom and the need for there to be professional training for staff in order to upgrade their, firstly, their knowledge of spec ed students, and also their ability to deliver programming using modern evidence-based pedagogies, which, by the way, are going to help all students, not just spec ed students. Now, a couple of areas where this is happening right now on a very small scale are ones that are being run out of LSS. One of them is an initiative which is partially funded out of EPO funding from the ministry to do an appreciative inquiry on math for LD students in a small number of schools. And it's ongoing this year, so we haven't heard final results of it. Additionally, as a result of the LD review and the new model for the program for those students at the highest need, there has been a lot of work and development, both of knowledge and of approaches, which have utilized quite a few staff members. And this is, it sounds very promising, but again, there's going to be a review that will come up. It's going to be, there's a survey of parents going to be going out very shortly, but it does sound very promising. Now, both these studies impact a very small number of parents, a very small number of students. So, you know, in order to be really effective, assuming these programs have been found to be effective, and to extend them so they bring advantages to all students, not only spec ed students, but as I say, some of these initiatives and approaches will inform teachers in such a way that they will benefit all students. They will be, you know, they'll have to be extended, and this will take resources. So the resources that are coming into LSS for next year will certainly not go amiss. They will be well used. But, you know, I do agree that there should be more transparency in how this is shown. And, you know, perhaps that is something that can also be asked for in terms of information from LSS on how it's using the money to provide equity, quite frankly, for these students so that they can catch up to their peers in terms of their learning needs. I think it's probably a little bit too soon to ask that question, unless I'm wrong. I've gone over my time, but if there are any staff comments on that, I notice that Superintendent Grigoriev is here. Any comments on this at this point in time? Certainly, but on the other hand, I can understand that since we don't know exactly where the staffing is going for next year and the plans haven't been made, it may be a little bit preliminary to ask this as a question.
I'll make a couple of comments and I'll pass it over to the superintendent. As far as results, trustees and the public, we bring an annual student achievement report forward every fall, where we look at all of our students' results, and we disaggregate by one of the categories that we do are children with special needs. And that's one of the annual benchmarks that we have to be able to look at how our children with special needs are performing compared to the other students in the school district with respect to grade 3, grade 6, grade 9. In the high school, the percentage grades at the end of the school year in each of the core courses, and credit accumulation. So we do have that information, and we share it at an annual basis. What's hard to say is when there's a particular investment, when we add in 5 EAs to the system, it's very hard to isolate the impact. What we would say is that the investments that we're making overall, we look to see how the overall group of children with special needs are performing. Certainly when we make a significant change in a program model, and the LD model is one of them, where there is a research group actually looking at how that implementation has gone through, and I'll pass it over to the superintendent to make a comment on that. One of the ways you've talked about the huge importance of professional learning, and we couldn't agree more, and that's for all of our employee groups. And that's one of the reinvestments that you see in here, is that we realized in last year when we took out some of the dollars, you saw it divided into 2 categories. One was, well, there was a couple of categories. One was some PD for behavior management, BMS programming for special education, and we know that that's directly to try to help to deal with some of the issues that we have in our classrooms. You saw an amount, I believe it was for $330,000 for curriculum services, school supports. We realized that some of the dollars that we actually took out last year were dollars that were not for professional learning, but were actual dollars that were, for example, at the grade 7 and 8 level, we provide dollars for release for grade 7 and 8 teachers to provide kind of a guidance support instead of having positions to do that. And so we had taken those dollars out, and of course we had to put them back in because that support hasn't changed. And then the final category was about $400,000 for professional learning in all sorts of areas. One of the strategies that we're trying to do, and the superintendents, Sean Lehman, who leads BNLT, Dorothy Baker, who leads curriculum services, and Olga with learning support services, is trying to make sure that we're getting a bigger bang for our buck out of our professional learning, and that we're looking at those 3 pots of money and the human resources that we have attached to those 3 departments, and we're trying to make sure that we have it more integrated and having a bigger bang for the buck, shall we say. And so that's one of the key strategies that we've been really moving towards this past year, and that will continue next year. Olga, I don't know if you want to add.
Certainly, I can add to that just to reinforce that everything that we do now, we try to collaborate between the 3 departments, and we've had some success with that model. And looking forward through the professional development that we will be implementing next year, and the budget is identifying that we will be pooling our human resources as well as financial resources to capitalize on that, and also to serve students more effectively when we collaborate. The LD inquiry that we've been able to do 2 years in a row now through the addition of MISA funding has been monitored throughout. We're looking at student improvement based on some specific marker students and their outcomes through before the inquiry and then after the inquiry. But it is a process where we're not necessarily going to see the impact of that on a large scale, as in through EQAO results, but we will see it in the capacity building of staff to be able to serve better students that do have learning disabilities in math as a start, and then that will extend into other areas. And so we do, throughout that inquiry, we do speak with staff and ask them to comment on their change in capacity and mindset and some of the strategies that they've used. So that's one way of measuring the impact that we're having. And also we have collaborated with curriculum services in terms of funding for that approach through the renewed math strategy. So while the emphasis is on math right now, over time that approach of looking at specific student profiles with their learning disabilities in mind will help us to learn what all students need specifically in order to be able to program for them more effectively.
Thank you. Trustee Blackburn?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. If I may, could I cede the floor to Mr. Bickford for the addressing the social work thing, because it may affect my comments, and I know when others spoke about that, he put up his hand, so I think he has a comment about that.
Certainly you can. Mr. Bickford.
You're reading my mind. Yes. A clarification about the vacancy. In April 2016, a social worker retired, and I did the casual work for May and June. The position was not filled on a permanent basis until September, when they could do the whole caseload. Was the position empty? No, I did the work. This year in March, another social worker retired. Did the schools go without service because the position was vacant? No, there were fill-ins, but they didn't want to fill the positions because, as earlier said, from January on, they haven't been wanting to make permanent hires. So is the work still there? Yes, the work is there. However, under the current contract and extension, if a member retires, then the position can be deemed to be for attrition. So the board has chosen to make the social work position one of attrition rather than one of, I would say, vacancy. So that's the clarification about social work.
Thank you, Mr. Bickford. Then Trustee Blackburn, did you want to respond?
Oh. I'm happy with the clarification, and I'll move on to what I was going to say. So through you, thank you to staff for once again preparing this very massive document that with a lot of work that goes into it. I have a couple comments. One is about the accommodation review process. I will echo what Trustee Seward said. I mean, obviously that process has financial implications, as do most everything we do at the board, but from my perspective it is primarily about student learning. And as an example, I'm very pleased with the situation that we're going into next year at Gloucester. We're going to have a fulsome student population, with the board making substantial investments in those students who we heard time after time after time are higher risk students. And I'm quite pleased with that, and looking forward to giving those kids the best opportunities moving forward, better opportunities than they've had up until now. I would like to address the, it was mentioned that staff was recommending a bolster in the spending in the BNLT area. And as far as that is concerned, I think it's imperative that finally this board follow through with the staff recommendations in this area. One of the reasons why it is higher, I believe the figure was 15%, is because over the past few years we haven't done the investments. So what happens when you don't do incremental proper investments year after year? After a certain amount of time, you have to make a substantial investment. This is a very big district that involves thousands upon thousands of people. We store private information, we have payroll to meet. We cannot afford not to have a proper computing infrastructure. The cost of not having a proper computing infrastructure with updated systems can be monumental. Can you imagine if we can't make payroll because our computer system is not working properly? Can you imagine if we're not able to properly secure people's private information? Can you imagine the cost to the board if we can't do these things? So I finally urge my colleagues to stop putting off this investment and finally this year make the proper investments in our computing system to avoid the risk that not doing those investments can put us at. Thank you.
Just a quick comment. That's kind of a classic example of, although the positions are located centrally, it's one of the things that I'm trying to get away from is the idea of whether they're central positions or school-based positions. Because although they're located centrally, there's not a school-based person that would want to end up in a situation like our federal government counterparts where payroll was not available and not working properly. We know that that would have a dramatic impact on all of our staff that work in schools. And so that's a classic example of its positions that are located at the central office, but they absolutely support our school-based staff and indirectly students.
Thank you very much. Mr. Bickford, I apologize I did not give you full time, so if you have additional questions, go ahead.
Yes, I have another question rather than the clarification. On page 47, Appendix F, the drug counseling program. Historically, the social work and psych staff used to provide drug and alcohol counseling. Then the ministry chose to provide funding if there were partnerships with community agencies. So my question is this: where is the ministry funding for that partnership that sustains some of this drug and alcohol program? And where is the expenditure line for the total expenditure of the drug and alcohol program?
We can certainly get that overall number. I'll pass it over to CFO Carson. As you know, the contract is with Rideau Wood counselors or Rideau Wood Center, and the amount comes through partly through ONFI and partly some funding through United Way, and then partly some funding from the school board as well. And we can provide that information. I'm not sure if the CFO has that handy right now, or if not, we can respond to that in a written answer.
I think, Mr. Chair, in the interest of time, we'll do it as one of the Q&As. It's just to give the page reference. The directors covered the biggest part of the change in those dollars, and the fact that they have been, this district has made a commitment to try to encourage and increase and maintain the support beyond that funding level as well.
It's a very significant, and actually I would like the information shared, because I'm not sure if people realize that the board is making a significant contribution to those funds. Part of them do come from our partnerships, but the board is actually contributing a significant amount. And when you think of our overall special education, et cetera, this isn't special education necessarily, but it's certainly a huge support to very at-risk kids. So we'll gather that information and share it. I think it's important that in addition to the other supports that the boards provide for high-risk students, this is a significant amount of money that the board itself actually contributes.
So the expenditure line will be coming then as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Walter.
Yep. This doesn't seem, there we go. I'm not here very often, so some of you don't know who I am. And it doesn't say on my tag here, but I'm Chief Negotiator with Educational Support Professionals Bargaining Unit here in Nancy's stead. So we represent Office Clerical Technical both centrally and in the schools. And right now I'd like to just touch on our staff in the schools and maybe first get some clarification here back to something that Trustee Menard spoke to about the cuts, the proposed cuts to staffing in the schools. I just sort of like to clarify first the difference between, so accommodation review had, I believe, 9.2 FTE in the schools of our Office Clerical Technical, and then the recommended changes total is 13, I believe. So I'm just wondering, what is the additional actually impact, actual body cuts to staffing in the elementary and secondary of Office Clerical Technical?
We're, sorry, a little conference going on.
Sure.
The 9.25 were the ones that were specifically school related and included in that reduction. Beyond that, we then took a look at the changes that fall out of, that were not associated with the school reductions. So they are a cumulative total, I think. I'll double check that, Leaf, and get back to you.
So am I correct, though, or am I close to the mark of it's 4 additional staff, FTE coming out of elementary and secondary, a direct office support? Is that about right?
I believe it is.
Okay,
we'll verify that for you.
Okay, and so that's on top of the 12 FTE of those people who were lost in the schools last year through the budget process. Is that about right for the figure last year?
I believe it was somewhere in the region of 10 to 12 full-time positions.
I'd just like to say, I mean, certainly last year, but throughout the year, we didn't actually see it with those cuts. We didn't see any changes to expectations or adjustments to workload or delivery expectations happen. And I'd like to say, you know, with these additional cuts, the stress that's going to result from it, and I'm sure Nancy's spoken to some of the trustees here about the stress associated with that. It's nice to see at least that there's a few million being thrown into wellness to try and counter that situation, because this is certainly not going to help. If I can just make a second point here about the local priorities funding, which has been included in this budget process. I hope that the trustees have seen the terms of reference about that funding. It came directly out of the negotiations of the contract extension. I'd just like to say for our members, I certainly don't think that they understood that the intention of that to be either, you know, contributing, buying a surplus for the board, or in some way doing a shell game with the staffing for them that doesn't address the stress that was related to the cuts previously. It was negotiated, I think, on our part. Don't know, wasn't in the negotiations. It doesn't work that way anymore. But I think that we expected something out of it, something more out of it, and that if this budget passes with these current recommendations, I think that on behalf of my members who will have contributed 12 FTE, that's the funding that came out of our portion. On behalf of our members to staff, I'd like to say you're welcome. Okay. Thanks.
Thank you. It's about 5 minutes after 9, and we still have a few members on the list, so let's take a 5-minute break and come back at about 10 minutes after 9. All right, trustees, let's get back at it. We have quorum, so let's restart the meeting. And the list is continuing with Trustee Olson-Harper.
Thank you, Miigwech. I just have a question about page 33 on the binder, and it's related to a question that Trustee Seward asked earlier. And I'm wondering how much are the projected savings from the impacts of the of the accommodation reviews beyond the current year's budget? And for how many years in the future will we be continuing to save? Thank you. Miigwech.
Mr. Chair, there's 2 or 3 pieces to it. The savings will be, the operating savings themselves will be permanent. We will have, once we dispose of the existing buildings, we will see an increase in those savings of, I believe it's about $200,000 we have this year, $200,000 to $250,000, which is the bare minimum to maintain those, the integrity of the buildings and provide security, et cetera. That will be a permanent saving thereafter. And then the proceeds from the disposition of the building, obviously that's a one-time influx of cash, but it allows us to begin to address some of our backlog of maintenance.
Thank you. So that 200,000 to 250,000, is that per school or is that for all 6 schools?
That will be for all 6 schools, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Miigwech.
Thank you very much. And now we're moving on to second-time speaker, so Trustee Menard.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I'll try to be quick. Actually, it's a question for you, Mr. Chair, first, in terms of process. The budget's been moved on the floor, so we have delegations next week, and then we'll be starting debate after the delegations next week. Is that correct? Okay. In terms of amendments to the budget, and I think it's important we do bring some amendments to best reflect the board's priorities, is there a date or process you would like us to follow in terms of sending them into staff? Maybe it's in the sheets and I missed it, but does staff want it by Thursday, let's say, or is there a date you can provide us that would be helpful?
CFO Carson.
Mr. Chair, because of the tight timeline, obviously the sooner people can give us the amendments they're thinking of, the better quality response we'll be able to give on at the next budget meeting. We will take a look at the Q&As coming out of tonight, and we'll try to prioritize those amendments. And what we've done in the past normally is where someone has provided an amendment, we will provide a brief written staff comment if we've got time. So since we're Tuesday night, Thursday would be great. Obviously, if people don't get to them till Friday, so be it. But if the sooner we get those, the better the quality of the response.
Okay, thanks for that. With regard to the office staff again, there used to be a general formula that we followed, I think, through a motion that was passed. I think it was 1.5 or something per school. But can you just clarify for me sort of the rationale for the cuts in office staff? I know we brought some last year and there's more this year, but what's the rationale around that, that proposal?
Superintendent McCoy is still here.
I have another question I can defer until perhaps she gets back. There's a few slides where it shows costs going up fairly significantly, so I'm just going to key in on a few of them. One is the extended day program, so it shows costs going up by $2.5 million for next year. Can you just explain what that is and if that's going to be offset by the fee increases that have already been done? or do you anticipate further fee increases? Thanks.
The good news is that we have more programs, more sites, and more kids. And I'll pass the rest on to CFO Carson.
Mr. Chair, we do not anticipate. This is what we were looking at when we estimated the fee increase that was approved earlier in the year. As the director has said, part of it is based on the continued growth of the program. Part of it is also based on now that those staff, we had to factor in the additional costs associated as a result of the collective agreement. So that's the salary increases plus the increased cost of benefits.
That's very, very good news. Thanks for that. The other question I had is in terms of costs going up, it was around the OCNet contractual services. It looks like there's a $2 million increase there. Can you just give us more information on that?
Mr. Chair, it's a function of the OCNet revenue coming in, and as the number of international students that come through to us, the flow through of dollars back to OCNet. OCNet brings in the costs, it brings in the students. We've seen an increase in that number, and this reflects the outflow of dollars associated with it. Again, we've been able to better match the costs and revenues associated with foreign students.
Okay, that's great. So it's essentially offset. Okay.
That's correct, Mr. Chair.
Fantastic. The other one I wanted to mention was, and it's the biggest increase that we see, is BNLT at 15%. And I want to make sure we're not having a debate about this being sort of an all or nothing, and that we're going to have systems crashing versus everything working perfectly. We all know that it's somewhere in the middle. So let's not stoop to that level. I think it's important to recognize that it is going up by about 14–15%, and that there's a debate to be had here about whether it should go up 10%, let's say, to make sure we're targeting the biggest things, especially when we've had so many cuts over the last several years to other areas. So I think let's keep that debate a little more, if we can, contained within reality. And
if I can just make a comment
Sure.
on that. We did as senior staff when we were looking at, we didn't look at percentage increase, we looked at actual positions and functions of positions, things that we thought that we needed to have support for in that department. And I think what we can do for the next time, or maybe in the additional questions, is we can kind of describe what each of those positions are going to be doing, because there's a couple of different groupings. We had originally said that we had originally suggested a significantly larger amount into this. This is the pared down, what we think is absolutely critical for the department to run. And one of the pieces there, it looks like it's in BLT, but that's the payroll piece. It's a combination of payroll, BNLT, et cetera. So we'll describe each of those clusters of positions so that people know exactly what they're there to support.
Okay, thanks very much for that, Mr. Chair. The other piece is there's this quality assurance piece, it looks like, within board services. It's a $1 million new cost just this year. Can you give us more information on what that is?
Executive Officer.
The Quality Assurance Division was transferred into corporate services area, so it's just the reallocation of the budget.
Perfect, thanks very much. And the other question I had was around the rationale for the cuts in office staff, and I think there used to be a formula that we followed. I guess we're not on that formula anymore. I just wanted some more information about that.
So through you, Mr. Chair, there is a formula that's contained in a board procedure that determines the office staff allocation, a different formula at elementary and at secondary. Historically, as we look at our budget situation, staff has brought forward recommendations in terms of reductions, and as part of that, our thinking is how we're going to implement. So generally, the formulas are adjusted to reflect the reductions that are made through the budget. So, for example, for the 16-17 school year, we made adjustments to the formula to reflect the reductions that were made through the budget decisions last year. And so similarly, if there are, through the budget, additional reductions that are approved, then staff would look at the formula and make similar adjustments, and that means moving the the breakpoints at which additional staff are added, moving those up or down to reflect the adjustments.
Okay, yeah, that's helpful too. Just in that, just so we trustees know, right? If we're reducing them, then the formula necessarily changes, and so that's an important concept too. So thank you for that. That's all I have for now.
Thank you, Trustee Menard. Trustee Seward, I had you on my list. I wasn't sure if you did want to have a second time around, but go ahead if you do.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question is very specific on Folio 37 and relates to what Trustee Menard just said about business learning and technology. Is the $700,000 on Folio 37 included in that percentage?
I don't think we really calculated it as percentages, but I'll pass it over to CFO Carson. We looked at it separately.
I'm just wondering where Trustee Menard is referring to.
Okay, sorry,
and I'm trying to relate that to the numbers on page 37. Because if 700,000, which is mobile devices for students, is in there, I don't see why that is under central departments. I think that should be in schools. So I don't know why it's there, and it's been troubling me.
Mr. Chair.
That's accurate. It is dollars that will go out to schools. It's allocated to BNLT because they're the keeper of the budget. But you're absolutely right. The dollars don't sit in the department. They're completely allocated out to the schools.
And
just assigned to the department.
Well, it raises a broader question of looking at these, some of the central things, is which of these things are indeed central in terms of staffing or supplies, and which of them are within the budget of the department but are actually going into the schools. They're purchased by the department.
So that's we can give you a whole bunch of those examples. So for example, professional learning and curriculum services. It's not professional learning for the staff in curriculum services, it's professional learning for staff in schools. But curriculum services receives the dollars and then they allocate them out to the types of professional learning that teachers, et cetera, are invited into. The BMS training is not training for LSS staff. It's allocated to LSS, and they create the PD opportunities, and they provide the dollars so that teachers can come out of their schools and come into the training. The $700 for mobile devices, we hand it over to BNLT, and BNLT has a process where schools identify what their needs are, and we allocate the dollars out. So there's a whole number of those, and maybe we can, in a question, kind of go through and do that. So that comes to the actual kind of operational budgets that are increases or investments. In addition to that, there are the positions. And the positions are a little bit harder to say, but again, what I would say as far as the however many positions we've put for the new payroll system, although they are located in one department, the staff is supporting payroll for the 10,000 employees that the vast majority are located in schools. So I'm not sure how we would describe that, but...
Well, I think what's becoming clearer to me, and I obviously haven't been through the whole book, is within some categories, there are things that are directly sent to the schools or given to the schools. There are other things that are on behalf of the whole district, but I think those things are different. I think the things that are actually going into the classrooms or that are going to professional development for teachers and others have to be identified so that we know, in fact, who is going to benefit from this. Now, you may have done that elsewhere in the binder. I don't know, but it's something that's...
No, we can do something with that. Mike?
Mr. Chair, it is complicated, and the budget binder was amended a few years ago. We capture costs for the purpose of the budget binder by departments. Every department's expenses are then allocated in yet another matrix which is how we develop the enveloping. So if we use B&LT as an example, I think it's, offhand, I think it's 70% allocated to instruction because it is supporting school and learning, and 30% centrally, so that every department we go through and we identify how much is in support of the schools. We'll have to take a look at what the document is, because you could create another binder for it, but we'll take a look at what we can do to provide a little better information for this year, and then we'll think about what that means for next year's budget binder. I think we just have to be, one of the reasons we've done it this way by departments is it captures the entire person. There have been times in the past when we try to do it by envelopes, where we'll use B&LT as an example. The elimination of one position really meant 0.7, a reduction of 0.7 of the charge to instruction, 0.3 of the charge to administration. When we try to do those reductions and adds by envelope, I say we, staff certainly get confused. I know it was confusing to the budget committee, but we'll see what we can do.
Trustee Seward, just on a point of clarification, are you referring to just a description on the investments that we have recommended and whether they're school-based or not, or are you referring to the entire budget binder? If it's just the investments, for example, the $700,000, we can say it's going directly to schools. We can go through each of the investments and say this is where they'll be located and this is who's receiving those dollars. But if it's the whole budget binder, yes, that's a completely different activity. I was assuming it was the former.
It is the former, and it is illustrative, but it certainly would help me to understand what things are actually going into schools.
Just the investments. We can do that in a response.
Thank you.
Thank you, Trustee Seward. Trustee Scott?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, just going back to folio 125 in the budget binder, the school budget allocations, and I guess when I look at this table, I'm having a lot of difficulty relating it to previous versions of how we allocate funds to schools, to school budgets in previous years. When I look at this and I see occasional teachers and office staff and educational assistants, I guess I didn't know that we were allocating funds directly to schools for all of those things for replacement staff, but that's what it appears to be from here, and I would appreciate having an understanding of when we actually started doing that, because at one point it was just the teacher replacement staff, the occasional teachers that were being given to funds were being given to schools as part of their school budget. When I look at a number of the other things that are variously labeled as not applicable, or it's very confusing to follow, and it also doesn't give me any understanding of how we allocated funds to schools for school budgets in previous years in any kind of clear way. And I think that's something we do need to understand, because I know that our school councils are out there, many of them working very hard to raise funds for all kinds of things. I know that we do have a provincial school fundraising guideline, which is somewhat more explicit about the things that school councils should be raising funds for or not than previously. And they talk about not raising funds for the things that the grants to school boards should reasonably be able to provide and are expected to provide. And for example, school councils are not supposed to be raising money to buy textbooks. This is where you start to get into some interesting gray area, because where do the mobile devices fit in the scheme of things. Some of our schools have sort of almost entered the fundraising for computer equipment. It's almost been a contest, as that school has more stuff per student than our school, so we really need to go out and fundraise like mad. And yet at the same time, without understanding what the circumstances in a particular school are, it's not the number of devices necessarily that matters. So I think in the longer term, Madam Chair, there is a bigger discussion that we need to be having about school council fundraising and the purpose of it, and see if we can clarify. And if I can add on to that as well, we also have the question of the RAISE index and its use in differentiating allocations to school budgets, which I thought we were going to see in May in terms of a draft look at the current way of doing it. And yet it is not appearing now on the long-range agenda for June either. And I had very much hoped we would be looking at it, because I think that becomes a very significant piece of our understanding in how we allocate funds to schools. So,
Executive Officer?
The RAISE Index report is coming forward on the, I think it's on the June 20th agenda. I'll have to double check, but I believe it was on the long-range agenda. If it's dropped off, I'm not sure why, but it is coming forward in June.
So we will be seeing that. But in terms of the school fundraising, I mean, do we have any clarity on how these mobile device funds and how the school budgets work relative to the fundraising capacity of schools, and parents, more importantly, parents' perceptions of the things that their school needs as opposed to can do without?
Mr. Chair, I think the whole school council fundraising is a huge topic, and you know, I think it would be hard to deal with that within the confines of this budget. I mean, at the end of the day, if the board wants to dedicate more dollars to school budgets, then we have to make reductions in other parts of the budget. If we want to be talking about what our school council fundraising policies are, we can be doing that. But I think that's a big topic that it would be hard to have in the confines of our budget discussions right now.
If I may, Mr. Chair, the more pertinent piece is in terms of looking at the school budget allocations and the proposed reduction of 5% here. I think that it is important at least to understand where we are now so that we can make an intelligent decision, or at least one hopes we can make an intelligent decision about whether or not we should be supporting that 5% cut or whether it should be something different.
Yeah, I think we'll provide more information on that because I'm not sure if we've been able to build an understanding around that. It's a 5% cut because we're taking the dollars that we have allocated out to schools for the use of occasional teacher and occasional staff replacement, and we're moving it centrally. So I believe the net change will not, it's not actually a cut, it's just a relocation of where those funds are. But I know people are understanding it as a cut. So I'm going to hand it back to the CFO, because I think it's really important that when we walk out of the room tonight, that there's a common understanding that we're not looking for a cut to school budgets. It's a reallocation of those dollars. And I see the Associate Director that would like to make a comment. So I'll pass it over.
If I may, Mr. Chair, I think what we really need here is the impact statement. And that's what is not coming through clearly. I think we do understand that staff's way of expressing it, but the question is, what impact does that have, not just on the individual schools?
I'm not sure if this will help, but when we reviewed these school budgets last year, one of the things that we noted was that many schools our concern was that they were in deficit. And so when we separated out replacement costs versus operating costs, which hadn't necessarily been historical practice, what we discovered was that really operational costs were subsidizing the replacement costs for staff absences. So by removing staff absences from their responsibility and creating a central pot to cover off that, what we're doing really is that they were already going into their operational costs to cover off the staff replacement deficit. So the implication of that is that from an operational point of view, they'll actually end up in better shape than what they were in subsidizing replacement costs. But also, and this was one of their major pieces of feedback to us, it gave them a better sense of control for planning purposes, whereas before they were saving and trying to create a contingency depending on what absences looked like as the year progressed. So I'm not sure if that's helpful in explaining a little bit of the impact.
And I think we have to be really clear that whether the costs are located at the school level or whether the costs are located at the central level, the costs are still there. So the overall piece is that we have to try to work at actually reducing the amount of dollars that are there. But we heard directly from principals that as far as management of their budgets, they felt very strongly that this was a step in the right direction so that they could actually manage the dollars that they have to run their schools as opposed to the replacement costs.
If I may,
Carson,
Mr.
I'm not
Chair,
sure if you had something else to add.
If I may, Mr. Chair, I'm hearing fairly clearly, I think, what staff are saying. My concern is that our school councils and most of our principals are not here, and therefore I think it is important to have something in writing as part of our Q&A that can be a public document that trustees can use when we're out talking to our school councils, that can be passed around among principals who are trying to clarify questions their school councils may have, that lays out what the trade-off was here. And I think that's really the big thing. It's not clear from the budget binder, but we need a tool to help us build that understanding of what actually staff are proposing.
CFO Carson, did you have an additional comment there?
We know that the schools overspent collectively by about $1.6 million last year. That's what they overspent. In order to control that, some of them underspent that school budget, and that's why collectively we're removing that pressure of the deficit off of their shoulders. So we can summarize that quickly.
Thank you. Ms. Handela.
So I'll take the step up on the box about technology. Actually, I have 2 points. So first off, $700,000 amounts to about $10, less than $10 a student for mobile devices. That's a challenge to think of, and the deficit is clearly being made up by parent councils. One of the core questions that we heard from parent councils impacted by the accommodation review was what was going to happen with all the devices and funds that they had raised when their school was being closed or being merged into other schools. Parents, specifically school councils, asked for an understanding of how it was going to be approached. We understand it as part of the transition process, but there is a huge, I'll say opportunity, so I don't sound so negative, for the board to demonstrate where mobile devices, where this technology investment is happening. It would be, and how it relates to parent fundraising, because parent fundraising predominantly occurs at the elementary school level in certain respects. And we had heard from parent councils who were, in the context of being upset, that if the board was just going to close their schools, they weren't going to approach their fundraising the same way as they were going into accommodation reviews. There is going to be an impact, depending if people don't know what happens to all this money they raise in the devices. And if the board is going to make an investment, we need to figure out a way of being transparent to parents to say, look at the tools your children are getting access to and how we are renewing this and how you're contributing and how we respect your contributions. So I would suggest that there is, understandably, a bigger picture, but in the context of this budget, you can plant a seed in those discussions.
So a couple of points. Executive Officer Giroux, if you can just talk about the transfer of assets of the things that the school council in a closing school, where those assets transfer to.
This is an issue we have been communicating on through the school council newsletter. Generally speaking, school council funds follow the students. So if the students are being redirected to a particular school, the school council funds that are remaining would move with the students to that school. It's a little bit easier and clearer when you've got a situation like a closure and the students are all being redirected to one school. The funds go that way. Where there's redirection of program, there's distribution of funds based on the percentage of students being redistributed. The other area that I think is important to note is where a school council has acquired assets or has done fundraising and made purchases for the school, those items become the property of the school. And they are determined in terms of the distribution of assets and where they would go. Presumably they would follow the students, but not always, depending on what schools are involved or what the nature of the assets are. So as an example, if the fundraising was for a play structure, the play structure was in place. Obviously the play structure isn't being relocated, but if it was for a play structure fund, the money would be redirected to the new school. So there are some variations. That's the sort of general overview. In terms of the broader issue of school council fundraising, I agree that it's an area that needs some further discussion, and it's an area that has ongoing discussion. One of the things that we have been encouraging school councils to do is, one, think about their mandate beyond the context of fundraising, and think about it in terms of building a sense of community at the school, and two, to align their fundraising plan with the school learning plan, so that there is some discussion about what the school priorities are and what the school council is focusing on, so that they're working towards the same thing. And three, I think the other thing we've tried to encourage school councils to move away from is the idea of supporting that sort of wish list or teacher list concept, and working more to what are the things that support the priorities of the school as a whole. And fourth, I guess, there are some provisions that do preclude school councils from spending money on assets that are supposed to be funded out of board funds. And there's some subjectivity to that, because what the ministry provided was a directive that was essentially a best practice guideline and not a clear set of rules. So there is some subjective interpretation around that, but it's an area that needs some further examination.
Thank you, Executive Officer. And I think I'll just add for the questions that you had as far as what will those $700,000, what will they purchase? I think I will say that we'll provide a written response in the Q&As with a little bit more information on what does that look like, and how do we provide supports to schools in the area of technology. The other thing is that I'm just thinking if that's a topic that is very near and dear to OCASC, that when you're planning your meetings for next year, we've got a pretty amazing superintendent who's in the room, and a manager of business and learning technologies, and I'm sure that they would be, if they were invited, very willing to come and have that discussion with you. Since he's in the room, I can volunteer his services.
Absolutely, and like it or not, I'm sticking around as co-chair, so I'll happily support that next year. I'd like to use my last minute to speak something a bit more macro. The biggest risk identified in this budget was enrollment. Best practice in risk management is to both do sensitivity analysis and reverse stress testing. Sensitivity analysis would mean how wrong might we be in assumptions, but reverse stress testing is what scenario would break this budget. And so I'm curious, and I appreciate the conservative estimates of enrollment, and I know we have the benefit of the census that I'm sure helps the planning in a significant way. How much would enrollment drop to impact the viability of this budget?
That's definitely a CFO Carson response.
Mr. Chair, we look at it in two ways. When an enrollment drop occurs, we have to be careful how I say this. if you've already committed the staff to contract teachers, then that's a fixed cost. We do, regardless of what staffing has been approved, we do look at those schools in particular where we know the numbers are weak or close to a break point, and sometimes we will ask the principal to, even though that staff has been allocated, to hold off the hiring of that permanent position. And that is one of the mechanisms we use to manage it. When you start to talk about what would break this budget, we're at a balance point now. So we know we can absorb some decreases, and we could manage that. But really, it's one of the reasons that we wrestle with it. We do not want to lowball projections because so much of it impacts on the actual organization of the schools in September and October. I guess the comfort level we have is that we have traditionally been at the elementary panel within 0.5%, and so we've been able to sort of use that as a cost factor, and secondary has been well within that as well. If you start to look at that, that's $2 or $3 million. If you ran, if that were to occur, and if we weren't able, after we made the adjustments in those positions that we had held open, then you'd take a look at what in-year reductions could you try and capture. And in the past, we would have run that small deficit and drawn down against the surplus. In our new reality, we would probably alert the ministry to that in the revised estimates. But that's the impact. That, you know, you're looking at probably a couple $1 million when you look at if this were to fall right off the table.
Thank you very much. Mr. Smith?
Yeah, hi, I'm just through you, Mr. Chair, I just wanted to respond really quickly to Trustee Scott's piece, just around the principal perspective on the 5% cut to the operating budget. As the Elementary Operations Chair representing elementary principals for the last 3 years, one of the jobs that we've done is to work with CFO Carson to gather feedback from principals on this piece. And I can say that 3 years running now, I wouldn't say anything is universal, but if there's one thing that has captured kind of the majority of principals' interests around operating budgets and managing budgets, it's been the unpredictability around the occasional teacher piece. So I can certainly say that the vast majority of principals have actually asked and requested that the OT budget be taken over centrally so that we can have more management and more predictability around our budgets to support the students we have in our schools. I think this could be really articulated in a lot more of a clear manner with a couple narratives that can be picked from schools, and we can certainly provide that. But I just wanted to address Trustee Scott's piece that as far as elementary principals go, this has been a universal request, and we're very happy that piece of feedback that we provided has been honored through this process. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Trustee Fisher?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Just very quickly, a number of people have touched on BNLT tonight, and I do note that it's quite a sizable expense projection, roughly $16.5 million. And I know when we have looked at investments over the last couple of years, we've made, I think, important investments in the deployment of various information and communication technologies across the board, and investments in digital learning environments, whether it's the Wi-Fi and smart boards, to the wireless devices, to the payroll systems and the new telephone system. And I guess what I would like to get a sense within this budget, and maybe this goes to the narrative that Trustee Scott was talking about, is whether or not we can get a bit of a forecast in terms of where BNLT wants to go next. When I look at the investments we've been making over the last 10 years, I think it's safe to say that the digital environment has moved quite quickly beyond wireless devices, and I would certainly be interested to know what the vision is in this budget and perhaps in future years around the adoption of or integration of machine learning or analytics or other aspects like that into the operations of the board, because I do feel that there's huge potential there in terms of leveraging the capabilities that exist now that we haven't really scratched the surface on. We're still talking about wireless devices and phones and things like that. So I'd certainly like to get a better sense of where we're heading in terms of BNLT generally, but also that next leap in terms of ICT and digital learning. Thank you.
Further questions, trustees? Nothing? Okay. Is there any new business? Seeing none. Just like to advise the next meeting of the... Sorry?
I just have a tiny bit of new business, and it's not really related to the budget, but the new business is, I lost the student trustee. Our student trustee, Alex, was a winner at CAPES, and I wanted to congratulate him, but we'll wait until the next committee of the whole where we have him in front of us.
Trustee Blackburn?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Again, not related to the budget, but I'd like to wish Ms. Hendela a happy birthday.
Thank you very much. So the next meeting of the Committee of the Whole Budget is June the 5th, 2017 at 7 p.m. and that's where delegations and debate will commence. Seeing that, meeting is adjourned.